1976, Utica, Michigan, USA. A 27-year-old man returns home. An ordinary day, an ordinary life. At some point, several men approach him. They knock him to the ground. He tries to break free. His arms are twisted behind his back. His face is pressed against the floor. Cuts remain on his chin and right cheekbone. The inside of his lower lip is lacerated. They tie his hands and feet, carry him into a small room, and throw him onto a cot. And for the next 3 days, his hands will remain tied behind his back, non-stop. There's only one goal: to force him to renounce his faith. When he refuses to speak or eat, one of his captors threatens him with a series of shots. Later, in a statement, he writes that at one point he felt not like a human being, but like a captured animal. His name is Arthur Rosell, and the name of one of those who, according to Arthur Rosell's affidavit, participated in his confinement is Stephen Hassan. Remember that name. You will hear it many more times today. October 1981, Ohio, USA. Two 20-year-old women are walking home. Two men stop them, as if to ask for directions. A second later, one is sprayed in the face with gas. The other is dragged toward a van. Inside the van is her father. Then comes a 400-mile drive south to a cabin in Alabama. Later, the young woman would recount that over the next 7 days, she was subjected to physical and sexual abuse. For the rape and abuse of their daughter, her parents paid $8,000. February 2008, Tokyo, Japan. An apartment in an ordinary residential neighborhood of Suginami. A man in his 40s steps out of the apartment, emaciated and suffering from severe muscle pain. He can barely walk. He weighs less than 90 pounds. He doesn't remember the exact date, only the year it all began. He has been held captive for 12 years and 5 months. His name is Torogoro. The reason he was confined for 12 and a half years was his membership in the Unification Church. A Japanese court would later rule the actions of his captors illegal, ordering them to pay 22 million yen in damages. But that money cannot return the 12 and a half years of his life that were stripped away from him. December 29th, 2017. Hwasun, Jeonnam Province, Republic of Korea. A 27-year-old woman, Ji In-gu, gets into a car with her parents. They tell her they are going on a family vacation. Instead, she is taken to a remote recreational complex, tied up and gagged. Soon, she will die. An autopsy will establish a high probability of cardiopulmonary arrest caused by hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. Her parents will be held criminally responsible for her death. On January 28, 2018, more than 120,000 people would take to the streets in Seoul and other major cities across South Korea. They have a single demand: to ensure that what happened to Ji In-gu never happens to anyone again. Different stories, different countries: the USA, Japan, South Korea. Different decades and different victims. At first glance, they seem to have nothing in common. Yet, at some point in their lives, every one of them was abducted, held against their will, and subjected to physical, psychological, and in several instances, sexual abuse. The core question: what do the forcible confinement of a man in Michigan in 1976, the sexual abuse of a young woman in Ohio in 1980, a 12-year captivity in Tokyo, and the death of a young woman in South Korea in 2017 all have in common? What links them together besides the violence itself? The answer is these stories are neither isolated crimes nor random coincidences. They are documented manifestations of the exact same transnational practice, which has its own name, a well-defined ideology, a circle of ideologues and developers, a network of perpetrators, and a far-reaching international infrastructure. Deprogramming is a practice that emerged with anti-cult activity in the United States during the early 1970s. At its core, it involved coercing individuals through abduction, isolation, physical and psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, starvation, threats, and in several documented cases, sexual violence, to renounce their religious, ideological, political beliefs, which had been preemptively labeled as destructive. And here, if you recall our previous episode, we once again encounter a familiar pattern. In our previous video, we established several facts. First, the transnational anti-cult network, whose central figure, based on the facts, is Alexander Dvorkin, did not arise out of thin air. According to open source records, its ideological model was brought to Russia from the United States in the early 1990s. Second, Dvorkin himself publicly confirmed on a Russian broadcast that the American partner he apparently worked with was the Cult Awareness Network, or CAN. This is the very organization whose legal collapse came after a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit filed by one of the victims. And third, Stephen Hassan is one of the key figures associated with the formation of anti-cult discourse in the West. The very same Stephen Hassan, whose name appears in Arthur Rosel's affidavit, the first of the 4 stories you have just heard. This raises some questions, which I will try and answer today. Who is Stephen Hassan in reality? Not the public image of a respected, undue influence expert that he builds for himself on TV channels, podcasts, lectures, and in his books, but the man whose name appears in court documents and the testimonies of victims of forced deprogramming. How did a methodology directly linked to abductions, rapes, and deaths come to be repackaged, first in the United States, and then in Russia, into a pseudo-scientific discipline, the concepts of which are now used by government experts, prosecutors, and judges? And most importantly, how did the chief ideologue, and later the architect of this system, a system whose early manifestations we just examined in those 4 stories, turn out to be a man whose own psychological profile, reconstructed by former FBI agent James Ressler in his book, matches that of a serial offender? To answer these questions, we need to take a step back to the period when the future Russian anti-cult model was still taking shape and when Alexander Dvorkin first came into contact with its American source. This is where James Ressler's observation becomes particularly vital. If we want to understand not just the later institutional form of this system, but its original methodological foundation, we must carefully examine the American period of Dvorkin's biography. It is no coincidence that in this book, The Serial Killer Against God, Ressler dedicates a separate chapter to this period. Its title alone holds the key to understanding the entire subsequent structure, deprogramming. This very chapter holds the key to understanding the structure of the modern transnational anti-cult network led by Alexander Dvorkin. Ressler describes his research process like this. While trying to understand the exact model Dvorkin brought with him to Russia from the US in 1992, he came across an interview with Dvorkin himself on the Russian TV show Vremechko, dated April 16th, 1996, displaying a lower third graphic that read, Patriarchate Staff Member, Doctor of Theology, Alexander Dvorkin. He speaks confidently to the camera.
Американский гражданин, у меня американский паспорт, и у меня все американское образование.
С какой организацией вы прежде всего сотрудничаете?
Она называется сокращенно CAN, это Cult Awareness Network, это сеть по распознаванию культов.
А как же ее темное прошлое?
Я не стал бы вот так вот действительно их осуждать.
These words are key. To understand their true meaning, we must look at exactly who Dvorkin wouldn't judge. The Cult Awareness Network, abbreviated as CAN, was an organization that served as the structural core of the American anti-cult movement from the 1970s through the 1990s. The founder of this organization is considered to be Ted Patrick, the very man whose name has already been mentioned in my previous videos. As early as the beginning of the 1970s, the American press described him as the leader of a deprogramming network that forcibly returned adult children from new religious movements to their parents. Patrick himself called this deprogramming, whereas critics and courts frequently classified such actions as abduction, illegal imprisonment, and unlawful confinement. Patrick publicly boasted about the scale of his operations in 1975. Time reported his claim of 1,000 deprogrammings. And in 1980, UPI reported 2,600. In fact, a lucrative business formed around this practice. The bill for Patrick's work could run as high as $25,000. By 1980, the sums had reached levels that would equal a six-figure check today. In the case of Susan Worth, sources cite a payment of $27,000, equivalent to $100,000 today. American courts repeatedly handed down criminal convictions against Patrick for kidnapping, false imprisonment, battery, and assault. According to archival reports, when he was once reminded that his methods violated First Amendment protections, he replied that freedom of religion, he said, was one of the biggest rackets the world has ever known. Remember that quote. We will come back to it. The same man is behind the second of the four stories with which we began this episode. The case of Stephanie Reithmiller in Cincinnati, October 1981. According to testimony and criminal trial records, the young woman was repeatedly raped for a week by one of the deprogrammers, while her own mother remained in the next room. Ted Patrick organized this operation. According to testimony from John Sweeney, the former executive director of the anti-cult organization CFF, many deprogrammers had sex with their victims and used drugs during the deprogrammings. This is the practice. This is the environment. And these are the people of whom Dvorkin said on live Russian television in 1996, I wouldn't judge them. It was around Ted Patrick and his followers in the 1970s that the organization emerged which, for decades, would remain the hub of this transnational abusive practice. As researchers' analysis shows, behind the seemingly neutral and academic-sounding name Cult Awareness Network, in fact lay a highly commercialized pressure mechanism, operating much like a racketeering scheme. This scheme could be described in several stages. Stage 1, using dossiers, publications, and the coordinated media dissemination of anti-cult rhetoric, can, along with a network of individuals who shared and promoted anti-cult narratives, work to build the image of the targeted group as a supposedly dangerous cult, This created an atmosphere of fear, distrust, and hostility in the public consciousness, laying the groundwork for subsequent discrimination, pressure, and aggression against the stigmatized group. By 1991, its lists included more than 200 religious organizations. Stage 2. Parents, terrified by propaganda about brainwashing and mind control, and convinced that their children, who were often already legal adults, were under the control of groups preemptively labeled as cults, turned to CAN for so-called help. Stage 3. In response, CAN would refer the parents to so-called experts on deprogramming, individuals who, according to court records and witness testimonies, engaged in abductions, illegal imprisonment, as well as psychological, physical, and in a number of cases, sexual abuse. Stage 4. The deprogrammers received payment from the families for the conducted deprogramming. Then, and this is fundamentally important, a portion of these funds was funneled back to CAN disguised as supposedly charitable donations through an entity called NARDEC, the National Resource Development and Economic Council. Independent researchers and former CAN employees, whose testimonies were cited on the Cessner platform, explicitly characterized NARDEC as the key financial hub of this scheme and as the central mechanism for redistributing funds received from deprogrammers. In essence, this was a closed-loop system designed to monetize the suppression of fundamental human rights and freedoms, along with the psychological, physical, and sexual violence that came with it. The atmosphere of threat and danger generated by representatives of the growing American anti-cult infrastructure groomed new clients for CAN. Deprogrammers profited directly from the act of violent intervention, while CAN benefited financially by recouping a portion of those funds. The materials produced in the course of these practices triggered fresh waves of moral panic against the very groups the system had already branded as cults. In this way, the mechanism sustained itself for years. But in 1995, this scheme collapsed. In the case Jason Scott vs. Rick Ross, an 18-year-old member of a Pentecostal church was abducted by deprogrammers acting on behalf of CAN. According to court records, Scott was handcuffed, his mouth was taped shut, and he was forcibly held in a van under which of a hired 300-pound guard, whose weight nearly broke his spine. At the end of the trial, the jury found that the defendants had intentionally or recklessly acted in a way so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Based on this finding, the jury ordered the defendants to pay Scott $4,875,000 in damages. CAN was declared bankrupt and legally dissolved. This was no isolated incident, but rather the legal culmination of an operation deeply intertwined with the practice of forced deprogramming. To reiterate, it is that very organization that Alexander Dvorkin, in his Russian television appearance, openly admitted was his primary partner. From this environment, this methodology, and these coercive practices, the central figure of today's episode emerges. Today, Stephen Hassan is positioned in the international media landscape as a leading expert on cults, mind control, and undue influence. He is a frequent guest on CNN, Fox News, the BBC, The Oprah Winfrey Show, Larry King Live, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and USA Today. He describes himself as a former high-ranking member of the Unification Church, claims he became a cult leader in 3 months, presents himself as a Harvard Medical School instructor, and displays the Jerusalem Medal on his personal website, claiming it is an Israeli state award for outstanding merit. However, fact-checking reveals a highly inflated self-presentation, where isolated facts, roles, and biographical episodes are assembled into the most advantageous narrative possible. This constructs an image of an internationally recognized expert and moral authority that goes far beyond what can be strictly verified by institutional standards. Hassan himself describes his transformation into a so-called cult expert in highly dramatic terms. According to his own narrative, while a member of the Unification Church, he was involved in a car accident. During his recovery, his family hired deprogrammers to subject him to the process. In his subsequent autobiographical accounts, he frames this specific episode as the decisive moment of enlightenment, after which he supposedly realized he had been under the destructive influence of a cult. Yet, in 1976, just months after his parents removed him from the Unification Church and hired deprogrammers for his conditioning, Stephen Hassan became a deprogrammer himself, a fact he acknowledges on an archived version of his own website.
The truth is that I was involved in about a dozen deprogrammings of members of the Moon Cult in 1976 to 77.
The first in the series of stories presented at the beginning of this episode is directly connected to it. Arthur Rosell is a 27-year-old member of the Unification Church. November 1976, Michigan. His affidavit, published on the Cessner platform, is a document in which Rosell testifies under oath that his hands and feet were tied. He was not allowed to sleep for 3 days. His hands had been tightly tied behind his back for the entire time. By the end of the 3rd day, his hands had swollen and were the color of a bruise. Professional deprogrammers Stephen Hassan and Ellen Lloyd then began working shifts to forcibly deprogram me away from my chosen religious beliefs. In response to his refusal to eat or communicate, Stephen Hassan threatened to inject me with a series of shots. It is also noteworthy that according to an archived version of Hassan's official website, he himself states,
I acknowledge that I was involved with the Rosell deprogramming attempt in 1976.
Rosell managed to escape at the end of the 2nd week. Yet his case is not unique. The following cases are documented under the exact same pattern. The case of Claire Kelly, December 1976, Peterborough, New Hampshire. Hassan acts as the chief deprogrammer. The victim was confined in a room with the door handles removed. There was around-the-clock security at the door, and she was deprived of privacy. The case of Lauren Sala, Freedom Magazine, as well as the media outlet Stand, report that 3 men forced their way into a motel room, physically threw the victim from the bed, and threatened to break her leg. After 9 days of imprisonment, when the attempts of the first team of deprogrammers had failed, Hassan was brought in to take over the attempt of faith-breaking. Publicly available sources also record information regarding attempts to suborn perjury. Arthur Rosell stated in an affidavit dated November 8, 1991, that Hassan pressured him to sign a pre-drafted affidavit that would refute Rosell's prior accusations against Hassan. According to published documents, he sent Arthur Rosell his book, Combating Cult Mind Control, A handwritten note pleading, "I desperately need your help." A prepared false affidavit for signature, containing the demonstrably false statement that there was never any time that Mr. Hassan kidnapped me, beat me, sleep-deprived me, threatened to inject me with a series of shots, or treated me unkindly or inhumanely. Roselle refused. In a publicly posted statement, he articulated his position on the matter with absolute clarity.
I feel that Stephen Hassan is guilty of subornation of perjury and for using the U.S. mails for an illegal purpose. I desire to have him criminally prosecuted by the appropriate authorities for these criminal acts.
All of these episodes are important not merely as a collection of private allegations or isolated scandalous stories. Collectively, they demonstrate something far more significant. By the early 1990s, Stephen Hassan's name in open sources was already linked not to some abstract assistance to individuals, supposedly trapped in cults, but to the concrete practice of forced deprogramming, involving forcible confinement, psychological pressure, threats, physical and sexual abuse, torture,
and subsequent attempts to distance himself from this past on a documentary level.
It is for this reason that the subsequent events of the mid-1990s were clearly not just another reputational crisis for Hassan, but a moment when the entire model demanded urgent public reevaluation. Following the legal collapse of CAN in 1996, public use of the term deprogramming became toxic. In the United States, the concept was now firmly associated with kidnappings, rapes, and multi-million-dollar lawsuits. The word itself began working against those who continued to engage in the practice. Based on an analysis of publicly available data, it is precisely at this juncture that Stephen Hassan executes his primary public maneuver.
Hassan elected to use the euphemistic exit counseling and strategic intervention for his blatantly abusive conduct, and he pursued academic credentials to plaster over his sordid past. Freedom magazine reported.
The practice of forced deprogramming receives a new, softer name, exit counseling, implying assistance in leaving groups preemptively stigmatized as supposedly destructive cults. Forcible confinement becomes a family intervention. The systematic dismantling of religious identity becomes assisting in the recovery of freedom of thought. This is the very step that, according to the analysis, transformed Hassan from a deprogrammer into a respectable expert. The name is changed, but what about the essence? As Cult News and a number of other publications note, Hassan himself states in his book, Combating Cult Mind Control,
forcible intervention can be kept as a last resort if all other attempts fail.
In other words, this phrase from his own book can be interpreted as follows. Formally, he does not renounce violent methods, but merely relegates them to the category of last resorts. According to the public data analysis, the primary branded intellectual product of the new post-deprogramming Hassan becomes the BITE model, which stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. The Freedom of Mind organization, founded by Hassan, positions it as a system for identifying authoritarian mind control. Hassan himself, in his doctoral thesis, frames BITE as a scientifically substantiated method for evaluating exploitive control and undue influence. This model is presented as a scientific tool for identifying destructive cults and is utilized today in FBI training materials, on resources associated with the U.S. Department of Justice, and within federal human trafficking countermeasure programs. However, independent analysis demonstrates the following. Firstly, Hassan's thesis, upon which the bite model is formally based, relies on a sample obtained via SurveyMonkey, polling exclusively individuals who already considered themselves cult victims. This can be interpreted as a classic sample of confirmation bias, a methodological flaw where the outcome is predetermined by the composition of the sample. One critic compared this to asking a barber whether people need more haircuts. Secondly, the bite criteria are so broad that they can encompass virtually any structured organization: a corporation, a political party, a traditional religion, or a chain retail store. Hassan has publicly categorized the following as cults: the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventist Church, supporters of Donald Trump, participants in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, anti-vaccine activists, the fitness boutique chain Soul Cycle, the British royal family in the context of the Meghan Markle situation. Reviewing Hassan's book, The Cult of Trump, the journal Publishers Weekly noted that Hassan's concept of cultic mind control is so promiscuous that virtually everything politicians normally do could qualify. Thirdly, the concepts of brainwashing and mind control, upon which the bite model is constructed, have been rejected by leading U.S. scientific associations and courts. In 1987, the American Psychological Association, APA, refused to endorse this report of its DIMPACT task force on mind control, citing a lack of scientific rigor and even-handed critical approach necessary for APA imprimatur. In the landmark case, U.S. v. Fishman, the federal court ruled that theories regarding the coercive persuasion practiced by religious cults are not sufficiently established to be admitted as evidence in federal courts of law. The European Court of Human Rights confirmed in 2010 that there is no generally accepted and scientific definition of what constitutes mind control. The most telling episode is the ruling in Kendall v. Kendall. Judge Christina Harms, reviewing a motion to disqualify Hassan from participating as an expert witness, delivered the following verdict.
The court found in that case that the theories regarding brainwashing, if you will, or mind control or cults that the experts wanted to testify to were not generally accepted within the scientific community. I vacate my qualification of him as an expert in cult and mind control.
Even while admitting limited portions of Hassan's testimony regarding a specific congregation, Justice Harms added a clarification rarely seen in judicial practice regarding a purported expert.
I will accord greater weight, far greater weight to the testimony of the Boston Church of Christ members, and I intend to place little or no weight on Mr. Hassan's testimony.
This judicial verdict is virtually never mentioned when Hassan is introduced as an expert on television.
Yet, it is fundamental to understanding his entire career.
Based on the analyzed materials, his public authority rests not on a model firmly rooted in academic psychology or judicial practice, but rather on his background as a participant in the anti-cult environment, and a conceptual framework built around brainwashing and mind control. Along with his public expert commentary, Hassan built a highly lucrative private practice. According to information published by Cult News, Hassan's standard rate was up to $500 per hour, or $5,000 per day. Following public criticism, this was reduced to starting at $250 per hour, or $2,500 per day. He charged $200 per hour for trial preparation and $1,500 per day for expert testimony. In April 2012, Hassan received an order to show cause from the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Allied Mental Health Professionals. The client had filed a complaint alleging that Hassan had depleted his savings and that the counseling sessions were traumatic, exhausting, and debilitating. The case was subsequently referred to the prosecution. Simultaneously, a breach of confidentiality was documented. Hassan had publicly posted a letter containing the names of 2 former clients on his website and social media networks. The licensing board classified this as unprofessional conduct that undermines public confidence in the integrity of the profession. The logic of this system becomes clear when one closely examines the mechanism embedded within the BITE model. Any resistance from a client is interpreted as the lingering influence of the cult, thereby justifying additional paid sessions. This closely resembles an endless loop of monetizing trauma, wherein the client falls into financial and psychological dependency on the very expert tasked with liberating them. It now becomes evident we are no longer dealing merely with the isolated story of a single public cult expert. Hassan's figure elevates the discussion to a much broader plane, to the question of systemic risks posed to democratic institutions. The fact is, anti-cult methodology is not confined to the religious sphere. As an analysis of the materials under review demonstrates, it functions as a universal mechanism of stigmatization that can be applied to virtually any group united by shared views, interests, or forms of collective identity. The moment such views are declared destructive, their adherents labeled brainwashed, and their leaders branded cult gurus, a standardized sequence of pressure is triggered: labeling, stigmatization, media panic, validation by experts, and ultimately administrative and legal intervention. A clear example of this can be seen in the case of Stephen Hassan. In 2019, Stephen Hassan published the book The Cult of Trump. In it, the millions of American citizens who voted for the sitting president of the United States are presented not as citizens with specific political views, but as followers of a dangerous, destructive cult. Consider Hassan's own admission, made during an interview and subsequently published by the Frank Report.
As a New Yorker, I had been aware of Donald Trump as an a-hole who is a misogynist and a racist, etc.
In 2021, Hassan stated publicly on CNN,
The bottom line is all of America needs deprogramming because we've all been negatively influenced by Donald Trump.
given the documented history of what a deprogramming expert precisely means by that word, this statement takes on a fundamentally different tone. Only a few years later, Hillary Clinton made similar assertions, calling for the formal deprogramming of MAGA supporters, whom she referred to as cult members. What we are witnessing is a prime example of how anti-cult narratives migrate far beyond the boundaries of religious polemics and integrate into the broader public square. Initially, such vocabulary emerges on the periphery, within the milieu of so-called anti-cultists, where terms like cult, zombification, brainwashing, and deprogramming are utilized as instruments of stigmatization. Next, the language is adopted by socially active individuals, public figures, commentators, and politicians. From that point forward, it functions not merely as a dehumanizing label, but as a mechanism of primary legitimization. Society is conditioned to perceive entire segments of the population not as holders of beliefs and rights, but as objects supposedly requiring salvation, correction, or neutralization. Through this logic, the rhetoric of anti-cult activists that was originally marginal in origin gradually gains access to major media platforms and, eventually, to the institutional field, where terms like cult and deprogramming cease to be mere emotional slurs and begin to function as a quasi-legal argument. This is precisely how a dangerous precedent is established. Under the guise of protecting society, or ensuring psychological security, the apparatus of stigmatization begins to be deployed not only against religious associations, but also against political movements, social groups, and any form of dissent. And note that in the context under examination, this is not merely about Donald Trump as a public figure or an individual. This concerns the sitting president of the United States of America. Ask yourself a logical question. Why does the law enforcement system fail to protect the head of state, who is systematically subjected to destructive manipulation, coordinated media attacks, and public dehumanization, enforcement, and human rights systems, whose stated objective is the protection of citizens, systematically ignores concerning the activities of organized networks, whose methods bear the hallmarks of violations of the right to freedom of conscience and religion, Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, discrimination on religious grounds, organized persecution of citizens based on their beliefs, systematic pressure exerted on judicial and administrative systems in the interest of private entities, the subversion of the principle of equality before the law, especially when these very violations constitute a direct threat to fundamental democratic freedoms. Why is the continued existence of an infrastructure permitted? One that methodologically inherits a direct line of continuity from the very practices that once led to authoritarian regimes and catastrophes measured in millions of victims. After all, given the facts enumerated above, this can be viewed as a challenge not merely to Donald Trump as an individual, but as a challenge to the entire system of justice tasked with protecting the rights and freedoms of its own citizens. It is for this reason that Hassan's subsequent public statements merit close attention. The media outlet Art Voice documented the following.
On a September 2025 live stream, Hassan stated, "People will see him in his trafficking glory, which we already have overwhelming evidence that he liked underage girls. He was a trafficker himself." On the same broadcast, "I'm criticizing Donald Trump as being a malignant narcissist, which is the stereotypical profile of all destructive cult leaders based on Adolf Hitler's profile."
These remarks appear particularly paradoxical and generate additional dissonance when another significant layer of information regarding Stephen Hassan is brought into view. On his website, he states the following.
Stephen was a featured speaker and at the U.S. Department of Justice's 2009 National Amber Alert Symposium, where he explained why victims don't flee and how children abductors convince victims to stay. In 2013, Hassan participated training over 600 law enforcement professionals at the Joint Regional Intelligence Center in California on human trafficking.
In other words, Stephen Hassan has for many years publicly positioned himself as a leading defender of children against sexual exploitation and human trafficking. However, cross-referencing this public persona with connections documented in open sources reveals a systemic contradiction that goes far beyond mere coincidence. According to an analysis provided by James Ressler in the book The Serial Killer Against God, Hassan's Freedom of Mind website features links to the resources of Anton Hein. Hassan publicly recommends Hein as a useful resource, subscribes to his newsletter, religion blog, and references him as an expert. Hein, in turn, similarly promotes Hassan. But who is Anton Hein? According to reports by Cult News and court documents from San Bernardino County, California, Anton Hein pled guilty in 1994 to a felony charge of lewd and lascivious acts with a minor, specifically his own 13-year-old niece. Criminal Court Minute Order Number 3, dated July 22, 1994. The guilty plea entered in open court, and the subsequent sentencing, order dated May 13, 1995, are all publicly accessible documents. After serving a portion of his sentence, Hein violated the terms of his parole and fled the United States for Amsterdam. A no-bail arrest warrant issued by the San Diego County Sheriff for his immediate apprehension remains active to this day. And yet, for many years, Hein has positioned himself as a cult expert, operating the platform Apologetics Index. Furthermore, and this warrants special emphasis, Anton Hein's Apologetics Index is included in the list of recommended sources on the official website of the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Higher Martyr Irenaeus of Lyons, which is headed by Alexander Dvorkin. In other words, a media outlet run by a convicted pedophile who, according to Cult News, is currently a fugitive in Amsterdam, is simultaneously recommended as an expert resource on the topic of cults by Hassan's American Center and Dvorkin's Russian Center. Another prominent figure within Stephen Hassan's ideological circle is George Lee Graham. According to an investigation by Mexican journalist San Juana Martinez, detailed in her book, Children for Sale, and an extensive subsequent reporting, George Lee Graham established a network of approximately 40 orphanages in 2000. These facilities operated under the guise of a Christian charitable organization across Mexico. In 2008, following the escape of a teenager, Brenda Bernal Hernandez, from the Refugio de Amor, Refuge of Love, shelter, and her subsequent testimony, Mexican investigative authorities launched a probe. The investigation culminated in the network being classified as a criminal infrastructure utilized for child trafficking, sexual exploitation, illegal adoptions, and, according to open sources, organ trafficking. At least 25 minors vanished from the shelters. 7 individuals tied to the network were arrested. Lee Graham fled Mexico and remains an international fugitive. According to Mexican authorities, some of the children have still not been reunited with their families. The fact critical to this analysis is that prior to the public scandal, Lee Graham was not a peripheral figure in the anti-cult movement. He served on the board of advisors of the ICSA, the International Cultic Studies Association, an organization that formally unites the American anti-cult movement and maintains close ties to FECRIS and the Russian Ratseers. This very organization became the successor to CAN. Lee Graham was invited as a speaker at the ICSA anti-cult conferences. According to the official conference handbook for the annual ICSA International Conference held on June 22nd through the 24th, 2006 in Denver, Colorado, both Stephen Hassan and George Lee Graham appeared as speakers at the same event. This means Hassan shared a platform with the organizer of a child trafficking network, treating him as a recognized peer expert. Once Lee Graham's name became linked to the disclosed criminal evidence, ICSA swiftly scrubbed all references to him from its websites and publications. A standard pattern within the anti-cult milieu regarding compromised figures. Despite the fact that early Graham reportedly fled to the United States and Canada, Western media outlets provided virtually no coverage of the story. Hassan, who positioned himself in the public square as a long-standing child advocate, has never publicly condemned his former anti-cult conference colleagues, who was implicated in child trafficking. In addition to these two individuals linked to the anti-cult network, sexual abuse, and child trafficking, it is important to identify a third figure. According to testimonies recorded in publicly available documentaries, Czech anti-cult activist Jakub Jal appears in sources connected to allegations of physical and sexual abuse of minor African children. Despite this, Stephen Hassan has publicly treated Jakub Jal as a competent figure in anti-cult discourse and has referenced him in his own materials. An analysis of open-source data also suggests that Charles University in Prague may have been the likely location where they met in person. In 2017, the International Academy of Law and Mental Health held its International Congress at Charles University. Stephen Hassan participated in this Congress, and Jakub Jal was a student at the university during the same period. According to materials from independent researchers published on the Act Files portal, Charles University is mentioned by some authors in connection with the activities of experts and institutions tied to the Czech anti-cult environment. Cross-referencing these three documented connections reveals a systemic pattern that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. Stephen Hassan, who publicly declares a fight against human trafficking, the protection of children from sexual exploitation, and a relentless opposition to destructive cults in practice, recommends and promotes on his own web resources the materials of a convicted pedophile fleeing American justice, shared a conference platform with the organizer of a child trafficking network, maintains ties with and publicly promotes an activist who, according to witness testimonies in documentary films, is linked to allegations of sexual abuse against minor African children.
It is crucial to emphasize that the same pattern is evident on Alexander Dvorkin's side as well.
His center, which is formally accredited by Russian state religious studies agencies, includes in its publicly available recommended resources a link to the website of Anton Hein, the same convicted pedophile who is also recommended by Hassan. Basically, what we are looking at is an operational roadmap of connections, documented in the public records of two central figures of the transnational anti-cult network, the American and the Russian. And from this map, a critical conclusion emerges. The criterion of danger that Hassan, Dvorkin, and their associated structures and individuals publicly applied to religious minorities, political opponents, and any undesirable groups does not apply to their own allies, even when those allies have been convicted for the sexual abuse of minors, or appear in cases involving child trafficking or violence against children. This can be interpreted as follows. The declared fight against destructive groups and the protection of children serve as a discriminatory tool directed against pre-selected targets. The very same criteria applied with the utmost severity to new religious movements, wellness communities, or supporters of specific political views, leading to their dehumanization, are entirely suspended for individuals who are useful to the operation of the anti-cult network itself. And it is this specific pattern that becomes fundamentally significant as we transition to the question of exactly how the expert status of such figures is deployed no longer in the religious arena, but in the political sphere. In light of the previously reported comments made by Stephen Hassan about Donald Trump, an observation arises that is now relevant to more than just him. If one looks at the key public figures of the transnational anti-cult network, Hassan, Dave Troy, Luigi Corvaglia, Czech and Slovak anti-cultists and journalists, Alexander Dvorkin and his Russian followers, alongside a number of international activists tied to anti-cult structures, consistent pattern is revealed. Virtually all of them oppose the current administration of the U.S. president. All of them, frequently in sync, apply dehumanizing anti-cult rhetoric to organizations, movements, and public figures who in any way support the sitting U.S. president, Donald Trump. Furthermore, the groups they label as cults are simultaneously used as tools to incite societal hatred. The video game Far Cry 5, where anti-cult network representative Rick Ross served as a consultant, embedded into the minds of over 30 million players the image of a dangerous cult of conservative Americans, under the slogan, "Make Hope Great Again," an echo of Donald Trump's party slogan, MAGA, "Make America Great Again," whom players, according to the rules of the game, must physically eliminate to save the country. Hassan labeled the participants of the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot as tools of a violent cult, while concurrently marketing recovery services to them. In September 2025, Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, was murdered. Months prior to the killing, the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, which actively cites Stephen Hassan as a cult expert, published a report titled Turning Point USA, a case study of the hard right in 2024, as part of its Year in Hate and Extremism series. Kirk's organization was categorized there as a hate group. The systemic pattern emerges here with a clarity that is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. The media dehumanization of political opponents as fanatics, cultists, or threats to democracy lays the psychological groundwork for normalizing violence against them. The history of the 20th century has demonstrated this mechanism time and again. And it is precisely through this mechanism, according to the analyzed evidence, that both the American wing of the anti-cult network and its entire transnational infrastructure operate today. Within this logic, the logic of a gradual, yet methodical expansion of the network's targets,
One documented incident takes on fundamental significance.
an incident that usually remains in the shadows of the public discourse, but proves to be critically revealing in the context of this analysis. It clearly demonstrates how the practice of forced deprogramming, publicly touted by its proponents as a means of freeing people from the influence of dangerous, destructive cults, as early as the beginning of the 1980s, moved beyond the realm of religion and became a tool of coercion directed against individuals with certain political views. This case involves Susan Worth, a 35-year-old with a PhD in Spanish, a widely traveled teacher of English as a second language and an activist in leftist political causes. She was head of the Coalition to Fight the Death Penalty and a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. One day, in 1980, she was snatched off the street and forced into a van by 4 abductors. Her parents called her obsessed, believed she was belonging to a political cult, and paid $27,000 for deprogramming then involved gagging her, handcuffing her to a bed for 2 weeks, denying her food and water, and subjecting her to repeated threats. Dorothy Ehrlich, executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, said the case was the first in memory that might involve the abduction of a person for deprogramming for political reasons. Based on the facts listed above, it can be concluded that the anti-cult ideology, originally used to suppress religious minorities and various social groups, has been elevated to the level of a tool for political struggle. According to the arguments presented, this is evident in both the American and Russian anti-cult movements. Here, I'd like to go back to the point I mentioned at the end of my previous video. To recap, I laid out a hypothesis suggesting that Stephen Hassan serves as a public facade of the transnational anti-cult network, while the actual institutional development of its methodology and its practical coordination center are based in Moscow, within the structures built by Alexander Dvorkin. Today, having examined the true substance of Stephen Hassan's methodology, this hypothesis gains further weight. As I mentioned in my previous video, documented evidence shows that Dvorkin's main book, Sectology, Totalitarian Sects, which effectively serves as the text codifying the ideology and methodology of the entire transnational anti-cult network, draws its methodology and text from the works of Stephen Hassan. In Dvorkin's booklet, 10 Questions for an Intrusive Stranger, or Rules for Those Who Do Not Want to Be Recruited, which was later expanded into the volume Sectology, a fine print note states, materials from S. Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, were used in compiling this work. Vitaly Pitonov, an Orthodox apologist affiliated with Ratziers and part of Dvorkin's ideological circle, characterized this borrowing as plagiarism. Meanwhile, academic theologian Roman Kahn, in his work, Introduction to Sectology, highlighted the same systemic issue on a broader scale. Ideas that were not recognized by mainstream science in the West, the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association, began to be passed off here in Russia as the position of the Orthodox Church. In other words, what remained a peripheral framework rejected by the academic mainstream in the United States, but popularized by Hassan, was packaged in Russia by Alexander Dvorkin behind both an ecclesiastical and pseudoscientific facade. This gave the ideology a level of state and public legitimacy that it could never achieve in its home country, especially given the history of lawsuits over the coercive and violent practices that form the foundation of this ideology. It's important to note that Hassan and Dvorkin are not two independent figures, but rather functional elements of a single system. And this is proven by documented instances where their paths directly crossed. Fact 1. In October 2012, at the conference titled Apocalyptic Cults, Failed Utopias and Consequences for Followers, held in France, Hassan and Dvorkin appeared on the same speaker roster on the official website of FECRIS, the European anti-cult umbrella organization in which Dvorkin himself served as vice president. Fact 2. In June 2015, the international conference, Getting Clear, took place in Toronto. Alexander Dvorkin spoke at this event. His presentation was captured on video and remains publicly accessible. Stephen Hassan also spoke at the same conference, and his presentation is also on video. Furthermore, in an archived version of Hassan's own website, in materials covering this conference, Hassan explicitly lists Alexander Dvorkin on the roster of Toronto presenters. Fact 3. There is an entire web of intersections through mutual anti-cult allies. Czech anti-cultists, Stanek Wojtaszek of Charles University in Prague, British expert and close personal friend of Hassan, Alexander Stein, Johannes Agard, Jan Addick, Jerry Armstrong, Friedrich Wilhelm Hack, and numerous others. This is not a matter of one or two random encounters. It is a coherent network of ideological, institutional, conference, and personal connections spanning decades. In light of all this, the textual borrowing, the biographical details, the points of direct intersection, the hypothesis that Dvorkin adopted and expanded upon ideology he picked up while living in the US gains real analytical integrity. According to the files compiled by Friedman, Ressler, and independent journalists on the ACT Files portal, Alexander Dvorkin's biography by the early 1990s included a combination of criminal, psychiatric, and substance abuse instances, circumstances that made his public legitimization as an expert practically impossible. He needed a complete social and ideological conversion. In other words, a brand new image he could present to the public upon returning to Russia. And he didn't pull off this conversion randomly. It was calculated, strategically structured transition into a new social and ideological role. This wasn't just about getting baptized in the Orthodox Church and entering religious circles. According to James Ressler's analysis, despite retaining an internal conflict with the very concept of God as a supreme transpersonal authority, Dvorkin carved out a specific ideological niche. In this niche, the anti-cult methodology of Stephen Hassan, imported from the United States, could be presented not as a foreign import, but as a natural extension of an already established and internationally recognized Western practice. At the same time, hidden behind this public persona were connections and lines of succession that, according to a number of analyzed sources, led back to circles linked to direct heirs of the 20th century authoritarian regimes, and played a role in the subsequent refinement and radicalization of this ideology. However, this aspect requires a separate, more detailed analysis. Meanwhile, as Stephen Hassan speaks at American conferences, appears on CNN and Fox News, publishes books, and draws the scrutiny of anti-cult researchers and human rights advocates worldwide, the actual institutional refinement of this destructive methodology takes place in Moscow. Hassan remains merely the public brand of this network. Dvorkin, conversely, transforms it into a mechanism of systemic pressure, shattering lives, disrupting interfaith peace, and scaling this destructive anti-cult model to the level of state policy, before exporting the methodology from Russia to other countries, including democratic states in Europe. And now for the most crucial point. The reason today's video carries a significance that extends far beyond exposing a single figure or a destructive phenomenon within a single country. The transnational anti-cult network, as reconstructed through the totality of analyzed data, has never been a tool for protecting society. It's never been an academic discipline or a human rights endeavor, despite the public positioning of its representatives. Its actual function, documented over the course of decades and revealed through a comparative analysis of open sources,
is a systematic seizure of institutional power
by weaponizing the fear of cults. So, what is the underlying pattern here? First, anti-cult activists persistently seek integration into government structures. Dvorkin does so through the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation, effectively securing one of the key roles in state religious evaluation. Hassan achieves this by embedding his pseudoscientific methodology into materials associated with the FBI, resources linked to the U.S. Department of Justice, and the Department of State, and human trafficking counter-programs. Luigi Corvaglia, in Italy, demonstrates a similar, albeit more legislative, form of this same strategy, through connections with the anti-cult organizations, public speaking, and parliamentary appeals that echo his rhetoric. The anti-cult agenda is translated into the language of draft laws, criminal justice initiatives, and demands directed at the Ministry of Justice. This involves attempts to codify specific legal norms against groups that anti-cult structures have preemptively labeled as sects or destructive cults. Second, as demonstrated by an analysis of facts documented in open sources and human rights reports, this integration is not used to protect society. Instead, it is used to push legislation that restricts people's rights and freedoms. In Russia, this takes the form of the continuous tightening of anti-extremist laws, which in practice is applied primarily against religious minorities, Jehovah's Witnesses, whose 2017 ban affected around 170,000 believers, the Church of Scientology, several Protestant communities, Islamic organizations, and others. Third, according to reports by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, and materials from Forum 18, Human Rights Without Frontiers, and other independent human rights organizations, Russia today ranks among the countries with the most widespread documented violations of freedom of conscience in the world. Thousands of criminal cases, home raids, property confiscations, deprivations of parental rights, and actual prison sentences, all for belonging to religious or secular organizations and groups that haven't violated a single law, save for the anti-cult constructs developed by Alexander Dvorkin himself. Fourth, what has been tested and scaled up in Russia over the past 30 years is now being exported to other countries. And this extends beyond religion. It targets any organized community of citizens whose beliefs happen to be objectionable to the anti-cult network controlling the system. It applies to political parties, movements, communities, educational projects, civic initiatives, and individuals. A logic where dehumanizing label precedes the evidence, and where any behavior by the target is interpreted as confirmation of their guilt, has no inherent constraints. In other words, once this kind of logic is permitted, it can be applied to anything. Today, we've examined the American wing of the transnational anti-cult network that, according to factual analysis, is led by its chief Russian ideologue, Alexander Dvorkin. We've reviewed documented episodes of deprogramming, analyzed the biography and methodology of its primary public face and so-called international brand, Stephen Hassan, and established its direct institutional, textual, and personal links to the center established in Moscow. Circling back to the beginning and to the question with which we open this video, what unites those four stories? Allow me to answer that. They are united by a shared methodology, an infrastructure, an ideology, and a network of individuals who, for several decades, have systematically transformed a local criminal practice into a transnational mechanism for the systemic violation of freedom of conscience and the undermining of democratic foundations. And at the heart of this mechanism, today are structures built over the last 30 years by a man whose psychological profile was reconstructed by a former FBI agent as that of a serial criminal. And now, let me ask you a few questions. Based on the totality of facts we've analyzed in today's video, these are questions you can now answer for yourselves. Question 1. Representatives of the modern anti-cult movement, primarily Stephen Hassan himself, formally declared that the era of forced deprogramming is a thing of the past, that these methods are no longer used, that the focus today is exclusively on voluntary exit counseling. But ask yourself a simple question. What normal person, possessing a healthy mind, empathy, and basic ethical compass, is capable of participating in kidnapping, binding people, detaining them, depriving them of sleep, threatening them with injections, humiliating, insulting, and in documented cases, raping, or witnessing rape and concealing it, and doing all of this to people whose only crime was holding their own religious, political, or ideological beliefs, beliefs that violate absolutely no laws of the country they live in? The answer to this question is not rhetorical. It carries specific psychological and forensic weight. In forensics and forensic psychology, there is a well-established pattern. Systematic participation in practices that require the total suppression of empathy toward a helpless victim can be interpreted as a diagnostic marker of certain personality disorders, specifically those involving an empathy deficit, treating people as tools, and a need for control as a source of self-worth. In this context, the question of whether participation in forced deprogramming is a closed chapter loses all meaning, because the very fact of participating in it, even once, even as a witness or consultant, even if followed by claims that no direct physical harm was caused to anyone, already points to a specific psychological and ethical state of the subject, one that does not fade into the past with a shift in public rhetoric. In other words, to speak the language of forensic psychology, the personality structures that made participation in such practices possible do not vanish simply because the subject has changed their business card. They continue to dictate this behavior. They merely change their outward forms.
In the previous video, drawing on the reconstruction by former FBI agent James Ressler,
detailed in the book, The Serial Killer Against God, we presented the psychological profile of Alexander Dvorkin exactly as Ressler outlines it in his analysis.
This profile, as interpreted by Ressler,
Matches that of a serial criminal, exhibiting signs of grandiose narcissism, psychopathic traits, and a predatory, instrumental brand of violence. It includes a documented history of psychiatric hospitalizations, a background of polysubstance abuse during the hippie era, and episodes which, according to sources cited by Friedman and Ressler, involved acts of violence against minors in his youth and criminal activity in Soviet medical institutions. And now, ask yourself one final question. What happens to basic, fundamental human rights? The right to practice any faith, or none at all, to hold your own political beliefs, to have freedom of speech and expression, and ultimately, the right to simply remain human, when government bodies, the legal judicial systems, law enforcement, the media, and educational institutions are infiltrated by a network whose methods stem from the forced abduction of people for their beliefs, whose ideology is inherited from a post-Nazi anti-cult school, and which is run by someone with the psychological profile of a serial offender. This isn't a hypothetical question. It's about a reality where, in Russia, a single court ruling stripped over 170,000 citizens of their right to practice their faith. A reality where thousands of criminal cases have been launched simply for belonging to organizations labeled as extremists.
and this exact same model
Is now being exported to the US, to European Union countries through FECRIS, and to Central and Eastern Asia. And the answer to this question has already been documented in human rights reports on freedom of religion or belief. It's simply this. The moment a network like this reaches a critical mass of influence, basic human rights cease to exist as a legal reality. Sure, they might still be written in constitutions, conventions, and declarations, but in practice, they've been abolished. And this isn't some far-off threat. It's happening right now to hundreds of thousands of people. Today, we looked at the American wing of the anti-cult network, its public facade, its main player, and its methodological and financial machinery. But the full picture, the one that explains why this exact methodology has been so effective, why it adapts so successfully to different political regimes, and why it worked just as well in the Third Reich, in post-Soviet Russia, and now in modern democracies, only becomes clear when we dig into its historical roots. This is where I need to pause, because what comes to light when analyzing the history of this methodology deserves much more than a few minutes at the end of today's video. It deserves its own dedicated, fact-based breakdown. For now, let me leave you with a few questions that we'll explore together in the next video. Did you know that the prototype of the organization that systematically compiled lists of dangerous sects wasn't created in the US during the 1970s, or in Russia during the 1990s, but back in 1921 in Germany? Did you know that in 1933, these lists found a new, highly interested client? A specific agency, whose name most people today prefer not to say out loud. Did you know that the man who led the post-war revival of this exact methodology in Europe, 3 decades after the Nuremberg trials, was, based on available facts, the successor to the chief Nazi anti-cult ideologue? And that it was through him that this direct lineage eventually reached the person who passed it on to Alexander Dvorkin. And here is the most uncomfortable question. Did you know that in the University of California's academic archives, this alleged discipline of the Nazi ideologue and Stephen Hassan, whom we talked about today, are listed under the exact same category of files linked to the former American Anti-Cult Coordination Center, CAN? These aren't rhetorical questions. They are proven, documented facts that we'll break down in detail in our next episode. We'll look at archival files, historical studies, structural comparisons of these methods, and trace a clear line of direct mentorship and practical continuity spanning 7 decades. We'll have a full breakdown in the next episode. The history of how a methodology that literally grew out of a collaboration with the Gestapo made its way through 7 decades into modern Russian courtrooms, European sect filters, and US federal programs. A history that today's anti-cult discourse prefers to ignore. A history we must understand, as this is our only true defense against its repetition. And before saying goodbye, I'd like to ask you one more seemingly simple question. Given everything you've heard in this video today, and considering the sheer volume of facts, evidence of crimes, archival documents, and documented fallout, why do you think this issue hasn't sparked a broader public, expert, or institutional debate that matches the gravity of these findings? And what consequences could these facts have for democratic institutions and civil liberties in democratic countries? See you then.